Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm having a dialogue with Amos Guiora. Amos, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Allow me to introduce Amos to the audience. Amos is an Israeli-American professor of law at the Utah University, author of over 10 books and numerous publications, and we're going to talk about his latest book, Armies of Enablers, Survivor Stories for Complicity and Betrayal in Sexual Assaults. Now, he's been involved in those sexual assaults, USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, Penn State University, the Ohio State University, and the Catholic Church. Now, he has an education from around the world, not only Utah, where he lives today, but also from Western Australia and Leiden, the Netherlands. And your research has directly resulted in new legislation, which is criminalizing bystanders. Again, Amos, my pleasure and honor to have you on the show.
Pleasure is all mine.
Now, let's start off the conversation because we're going to talk about enablers in a digital space. To take the audience along, first, what is it? What's the definition of an enabler?
So to get to the enabler, let me begin with the definition of the bystander. The bystander is the person who's physically present when harm befalls another person. It's not important what causes the harm. And the bystander, to meet the definition of bystander, has to meet a two-part test. One, you have to have knowledge, which means you have to be physically present. And two, in order for them to be held criminally liable, they have to have the capability to act. And all that the law requires you today is to call for the police. We don't need you to jump in and be heroic, just call the police. So you have to have knowledge and you have to have capability. The enabler is, from a jurisprudential perspective, more complicated because the enabler, unlike the bystander, is not physically present. So when you reference my work about USA Gymnastics, Michigan State, Penn State, Ohio State, and other institutions, the enablers are those who were in positions of power in institutions and had knowledge about the misdeeds of the perpetrator and made the conscious decision to directly protect the institution, to indirectly protect the perpetrator, and to ensure the harm or guarantee the harm of the vulnerable individual. So bystander present, enabler not present. But as I can document to you in all of these instances, and I'm writing a new book on this, and the ecosystem of pedophilia, tracking teachers against whom complaints were filed, the enablers knew and chose to act, and their act was to ignore the complaints and to protect the institution, again, directly, and the perpetrator indirectly.
Great. So, hey, Amos, thank you so much. So we're going to talk about enablers in the digital space. Before I continue and come back to one of the first remarks you made, a little bit of context. You are a professor of law at the University of Utah. Any specific field?
When I first came to the University of Utah in 2007, most of my writing was in the field of terrorism, counterterrorism, national security, geopolitics. In the past 10 years, since the book about the bystander of the Holocaust came out, most of my day and night also focuses on enablers and bystanders in sexual assaults. In terms of what I teach criminal procedure. I teach 2 courses on the bystander. I teach 2 courses on counterterrorism, and I teach a seminar on global justice. But in terms of my writing today, not all, but most is about this issue about the enabler and the bystander, but teaching, I guess you would say, criminal law writ large, different aspects of it, but it pretty much circles around the same wagon.
Okay, got it. No, thank you for that context. Now, I want to come back to a remark you just made when you gave a definition of enablers and bystanders, and that was somebody is or is not physically present.
Bystander present, enabler not present.
Okay, but we're going to talk about how this behavior then manifests itself in the digital space, where physical presence. Can you still talk about physical presence in the digital space or not?
It's an interesting question. X years ago, I reached out to, if I use the wrong term, you'll correct me because you're obviously the great expert. I reached out to administrator or a host of an anti-Semitic website. And I got his name, number, and I called him. I said, I'm just curious, why do you post, really vile anti-Semitism? And he said, First Amendment, in the United States. Is he physically present? Well, he's using this machine, which we all have, whether, it's the iPhone or it's this or your iPad or whatever it is. And is that a physical presence or is that a metaphysical presence? I don't know. But it certainly, again, in terms of its reach, its impact, it almost doesn't matter where the person is who's posting, and it frankly doesn't matter where the person is who's receiving it, because through this means, we're able to communicate. I think the correct expression is unlimited, because the way that everything goes viral, which is, again, whether it's anti-Semitism or it's child pornography on the internet, which I guess there is a physical presence because you're filming a child. So maybe the correct answer is it's a combination of physical, tangible, intangible, with extraordinary harm. And I'm not really sure we fully appreciate or understand the extent of the harm that's caused.
Oh, we'll definitely cover harm later, but I first want to explore indeed how you could say enabling behavior in the digital space, how that looks like, so the audience gets a feel for what it means.
I think the enabler would be, I guess, child pornography or pedophilia, because that's what I'm writing on. If I'm filming, I'm there, and then if I'm posting it, I guess the poster, the website, I hadn't really thought about it. It's a great question. I guess they are the enabler of they're the middle person, the enabler between the child, the photographer, and the viewing audience, who's the recipient. But I would
sorry, no, I got a follow-up question for you, but go ahead.
I would think that the site, whether it's a website, dark web, again, you know much more about this than I do. They're facilitators, enablers, clearly, and from my perspective, 100% criminal.
Okay, but when you talk about pedophilia or child abuse, isn't that why in 1995, I believe, the states, the federal law was a federal law, the Consumer Decency Act, which tried to prohibit child pornography?
So you can try until tomorrow morning, but what do you do, for instance, with whether it's online or not online, with teachers who are predators, who go from place to place, who are obviously enabled, and if people post the pictures, because people post pictures, which, putting aside the fact that it's horrific, putting that aside, if I'm posting pictures of children, and somebody's viewing that, because people are viewing this all the time, I would think that would make the medium an enabler.
If that's the case, then aren't you basically attacking Clause 230 of that same Consumer Decency Act, which prohibits ISPs from any responsibility?
I would, from my perspective as the newbie to this, and the whole question of the enabling, and having focused primarily on the interaction, person-to-person interaction. But you are right that this machine, which we all live by today, I'm not sure that we fully appreciate the nefariousness, if that's a word, how it can be used. And if we don't need to re-examine laws in place or enhance them in order to be more aggressive in criminalizing those who are facilitating.
Okay. Now, the law which actually you helped create, which is now Utah it's going to be in the Utah legislation.
Right. It is already in the Utah legislation.
It's already there. So it's criminalizing enablers in the.
No, there are two laws. This past year we criminalized the bystander. Sorry. The governor signed. I write the articles. There's a legislator, Representative Brian King, who's the legislator. now the bystander is criminalized in Utah, and Governor Cox signed it last year. And in the coming weeks, Representative King, the same Representative King, will be introducing legislation about enablers. And I need to add, if Representative King were here, he would tell you that in the bystander bill, the word bystander doesn't appear. And in the enabler bill, the word enabler doesn't appear. But that's for obvious political considerations, which is why he's the master legislator, and I'm just the dude who writes the articles.
Okay. Does the word digital appear in that legislation?
In the bystander one, no, because the bystander is related to mandatory reporter. In the enabler one, I don't think the word digital appears. I'm today he will be releasing the bill, actually. What does appear there is how the word post is whatever the correct articulation of the word post. That word will absolutely appears there.
Okay, because the question behind my question is when you are able to, when you have a law, it normally restricts to a geographic boundary.
Right.
The minute you do something online in cyberspace, it could be a criminal offense in Utah, but the actors could be outside of Utah. Has that been taken into consideration?
I think it's an interesting question. The legislation, which I've seen draft forms, but not the final form, will criminalize those who, again, rather than calling law enforcement, they post it. Is it Utah specific or something in Utah that's posted, or somebody in Utah posted? I don't have an answer for you, but I think that's an excellent question, and actually there is no such legislation out there. And I think that if Representative King's legislation, hopefully, right, will be passed by the Utah legislature and signed by Governor Cox next March, I would hope that it would be a model for legislators, whether in the United States, in the Netherlands, anywhere and everywhere, because you're right, you're 100% right. The problem is not geographically specific, it's because of the internet, it's as global can be global. I think that is a great idea, and as soon as we're done, I'll tell Representative King that this was your suggestion. I'm serious, I'm being 100% serious.
Okay, well, as long as you refer to the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age, I'd be very happy. It's about acknowledging we need that discussion on a global level on accountability in the digital age. That's what I think was key.
I'm a firm believer to give credit where credit is due. I told King that we were chatting, and I will tell him that you had a great idea.
Okay, no, well, thank you for that. Glad to hear that. Now, in preparation of this discussion, I also understand that you have suggestions how to prevent enabling behavior online and potential potential obstacles. Could you share that with the audience? How would they look like?
So the enablers, whether they're digital or not digital, here's the good news and here's the bad news. Let's begin with the bad news. I always begin with the bad news. For reasons that I wish I could give you a compelling answer, the criminalization of enablers, because that's what we're talking about now, is enablers, has never been undertaken. The truth of the matter is, for reasons that, again, I wish I could explain to you, there's very little we empirically know about enablers. I know this sounds like this. I don't mean that in any way to be self-serving or pompous. You won't find another law professor who writes about this. You'll find other academics, but not law professors who write about this. And one of the missing pieces of research, which I'm desperately looking for data, is how to assess the harm that enablers cause. We can sit here for hours and we can tell stories one to the other that here enabler caused harm, there the enabler caused harm. And I have more stories than one can imagine because people reach out to me worldwide.
Well, maybe you can invite the audience, a call for action.
That's going to be my next sentence. I welcome, and you can share my email address with anybody desperately looking for statistical information, data, empirical, trying to articulate the harm caused by the enabler, because once I can have a database, empirical driven, it'll be, in my opinion, much easier to convince legislators of the harm, because stories are stories. I mean, they're horrible, but that's not really sufficient to convince legislators. In terms of call to research, call to action, a call to a call, I will interact with anybody on this issue, because I have a research team and we're looking for data, because we're looking also at this much larger ecosystem that needs to be untangled, and to untangle it, you need numbers.
Great. Well, we'll make sure that we get the message out, because what I like about having these dialogues is not just providing answers and solutions. In a lot of cases, we don't have those answers and solutions yet, but you also have an opportunity to raise the question, ask for help, and let's say connect and collaborate on a global level on these topics, because you've identified an issue which didn't have the attention yet, and this hopefully will nudge you to get where you wanted to go to.
I would be beyond grateful. And whether it's the enabler, the in-person enabler, as you can correctly reference, I don't know if the expression is the virtual enabler.
Mhm.
I thought about it that way. The non-present enabler, the secondary enabler. Sorry, secondary or virtual. I think that's right.
Yeah.
There are also notions about passive and active enablers, but in what you're getting at is I never say one enabler is worse than the other, but the enabler with extraordinary reach because of the internet.
Yes.
And the harm to the individual is ultimately the harm caused to the individual. Because what I can demonstrate to you is that the enabler causes harm because they fail to protect.
And enabler in this case, do you restrict your thinking to just individuals, people, or can also organizations or systems be an enabler?
So that's a great question. Go back. When I first wrote the book about my parents, the bystander in the Holocaust, I made the conscious decision not to discuss organizations, whether it was the Catholic Church in Hungary, which plays a terrible role, or German society writ large. I don't know, or the Catholic Church. I don't know how to do that. I know how to look at it individuals, right? Because I teach, you asked earlier, what do I teach? Teach criminal procedure. It's an actor. I am now looking into, that's the new book I'm writing about pedophilia, as the ecosystem of pedophilia, which is much broader. It really is institutions writ large. I'm also beginning the process of working with a professor of public health, looking at different variables where pedophilia might or might not occur. I mean, it's a huge project. In that sense, I think you are absolutely correct that the role of this machine, right, is something that absolutely needs to be considered in a way that from not the perpetrator, but the enabler.
Mhm.
I don't think we've really done that. And I think that in terms of this other project with the professor of public health, I think that adds with whom I'm speaking tomorrow morning, I think that adds a really important variable, expanding the scope of how the ecosystem, not my word, by the way, the word ecosystem is not mine. It's one of my research assistants who keeps telling me ecosystem, but she's right, because that's used the word system. She uses the word ecosystem, but that's really what it is. It's a system that is at play, which has one intention, and that's to protect the institution directly and to harm the individual indirectly.
Now, pardon me for asking this, but you're talking about legislation, I would say, from a more, say, classic approach. Like, okay, classic in the sense that what you're trying to do is independent of the digital technology and its impact on legislation. And I was just wondering, is there enough knowledge on the impact of digital in your research? So do you have people on board say, hey, we need to talk about this legislation, let's get that perspective in there to think about, okay, how does it apply in all circumstances where this could occur, and knowing that a lot of what you're talking about is moving online.
Listen, because I'm older than you, I'm gonna be straight up. You're suggesting something which I hadn't really thought about in terms of the misuse of this machine. When you and I are done, the first thing I'm gonna go do is text Representative King and ask him, how do we again, I leave the legislation to him. Don't forget, I just write the articles. If it's legislatively viable, it's not a word in English, but if it's legislatively viable to expand it, or if that's something we do next time, I think you're 100% correct.
Yeah, because it boils down to the reason why we're talking as the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age. The question is, when we see this happening, this criminal act happening online, who at the end of the day are the people accountable and need to be prosecuted? That's my question. So how do we make sure that we get
in Utah, those who would be however law enforcement tracks those who are doing the actual posting, they're the ones who would be held liable in Utah. But you are right about the broader context. I think it's a great point.
Okay. And a more generic question. Where is, I mean, in general terms, if you look at, I mean, we're to some extent, we're talking about a 21st century issue when we talk about, you could say, the online element.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been arguments in the past that the legal framework is not a 21st century instrument. We need to think about not necessarily other instruments replacing legislation, but additional instruments supporting that. Would you see something like that also happening in your particular case, what you're trying to address?
Listen, from my perspective as the one who's, I don't know if I'm leading the charge. I'm not on a white horse, because I don't know how to ride a horse, but the one who's invested in this, because survivors reach out to me constantly. My stock answer to a question like yours, which is exactly right, I'll work with anyone in any field. I don't care if it's a legislator in Utah, if it's a distinguished person in the Netherlands, if it's an international organization like the UN. I frankly don't give a damn. I really don't. What motivates me is to ensure that we find a way to convince the public that enablers are nefarious actors. 2, that institutional complicity has terrible consequences, and 3, to take the necessary steps, whether it's state legislation, whether it's federal legislation, whether it's international treaties, conventions, UN resolutions. This sounds almost stupid to tell you, but I probably get up every morning by 3:34, and I go to sleep when I go to sleep, and this is other than the hour run every day, this is what I do, and that's why I tell you that. Survivors will tell me that the harm caused by the perpetrator is awful, obviously, right? But that's not what really pisses them off. What really angers them is when they come to the realization that the institution that they loved, athletes, that they thought the institution would protect them, that they realized the institution utterly and totally failed them and was in a position to protect them. That's really what angers them. It's not the attack. The attack is horrible, but that's not what angers them long term. What angers them long term is when the recognition, I guess, by talking to me, that the institution that they thought would protect them, abandoned them. The word "abandoned" is not my word; it's from one of the women gymnasts who I interviewed. She herself was assaulted by Larry Nassar, the doctor, 750 times, which is unimaginable, Maddie Larson. But she will tell you that today she's not angry at Larry Nassar. She's outraged, that's the polite word, by USA Gymnastics when she realizes that they were in a position to protect her, and they didn't. And that's why I work with anybody in this issue, and wherever in the world and whatever medium they have available to them.
You talk about horrendous crimes being committed, and I'm glad you're also talking about, okay, taking a look at the bystanders. I was wondering, one last question in this field. Do you see a use for digital technology to help you in your quest to address this issue?
You know, I learned a long time ago, if you don't have a great answer, don't, BS your way through it.
Yeah.
I'm not a technical person at all. I mean, it's a miracle I can turn the light switch on in the morning. And when the computer doesn't want to work for me, it's like panic moment. But I know enough to know that for all the fun of the internet, follow a game on the internet and all that, it's great. The nefarious use is clearly an issue that needs to be addressed. And now that I'm really getting into this whole pedophilia thing, my instinct tells me, but I'm not empirically grounded to tell you that it clearly we haven't really addressed not adequately addressed the nefarious use of media. I mean, internet media, social media, this whole thing called the medium.
Mhm.
That's obvious. That's why I'm looking for help. I'm so honored to be on your show.
Well, hopefully this brief discussion will help you get the help you're looking for, get the data you're looking for. So again, this is something I really am pleased that we're able to provide that platform to
Thank you.
help you with your cause, because you have pointed out this is something which we really need to resolve. So Amos, thank you for sharing your quest with us, and
Thank you for having me.
hopefully enough people out there will be able to point you in the right direction, or
That would be
even
wonderful.
help you directly. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.